Everyone thinks they know the story of the 300 Spartans. A narrow mountain pass. A last stand. Men who chose death instead of surrender. It's a perfect story, dramatic, heroic, and safe. Because it ends where the Spartans die. But Thermopylae wasn't the end of the war. It wasn't even close. 10 years later, Greece was still on fire. Cities were being wiped off the map. And the Persian Empire was still standing, stronger than ever. The men who survived didn't become legends. They didn't get statues. They went home with nightmares. And sooner or later, they all faced the same question. Do we end this war? Or do we finish what Thermopylae started? This isn't a story about heroic deaths. This is the story of what happens after the legend. When Sparta returns, not to make history, but to end it. Thermopylae became a symbol. But symbols don't stop empires. Persia didn't retreat. It advanced. Athens was burned. Then burned again. By 479 BCE, Greece was exhausted. When Persian envoys offered peace, they were killed, publicly, along with their families. Diplomacy was over. Only violence remained. Xerxes returned to Persia, convinced Greece was already broken. He was wrong. He left behind General Mardonius, a commander who didn't negotiate. Mardonius didn't rush. He waited. Wide plains. Open ground. Perfect terrain to destroy Greek infantry. And he was patient enough to let Greece destroy itself. Sparta hesitated until Athens forced the final choice. March now. Or Athens joins Persia. That night, Sparta answered. Not with speeches. With an army. 5,000 Spartan citizens. 7 helots for each one. Tens of thousands marching north. Not to defend a pass, but to hunt an enemy. The Battle of Plataea is usually called a victory. But victory is the least interesting part of the story. This story is about what happens when discipline meets exhaustion. When revenge meets reality. When legends collide with logistics, thirst, fear, and human error. It's about soldiers who don't want to be heroes anymore. They just want the war to end. No matter the cost. And that cost would be paid on a wide, dusty plain called Plataea. When the Greek army finally reached the region of Plataea, what they saw was not an enemy rushing toward them. It was worse. Mardonius had already chosen the battlefield. Below the foothills stretched a flat, open plain, wide enough for cavalry to maneuver freely, with clear sightlines for archers and supply routes running straight through the valley. Along the river, the Persians had built a fortified camp, not temporary tents, but a defensive enclosure designed to hold position for as long as necessary. This was not a general looking for glory. This was a general looking for control. The Greeks understood the danger immediately. Heavy hoplite infantry was devastating in close combat, but painfully slow. On flat ground, against cavalry and massed archers, a frontal advance would be suicide. So they did the only sensible thing. They stopped. The Greek line settled along the lower slopes of the hills, refusing to descend into the plain. From there, Persian cavalry couldn't reach them effectively, and the hoplites could maintain formation on uneven terrain. What followed was not a battle. It was a test of endurance. Days passed. Nothing happened. No charge. No clash of shields. No decisive moment. Just two armies staring at each other. Below, Persian horsemen rode back and forth, deliberately visible. They circled the Greek position, firing arrows, retreating before the hoplites could respond. Casualties mounted slowly, the most frustrating kind. Above, Greek soldiers stood in armor that trapped heat like an oven. Bronze helmets burned their scalps. Sweat soaked into leather straps. Water became precious. Every man knew the truth. They were safe where they stood. But they couldn't stay there forever. Mardonius knew it too. He had no reason to rush. The longer the Greeks waited, the weaker they became. Eventually, Mardonius broke the stillness. Not with infantry. With cavalry. A Persian commander led a bold harassment attack up the slopes, pushing closer than before. Arrows rained down. Greek allies on the flank began to buckle under pressure. They sent a message up the line. Help us, or we withdraw. This moment mattered. If even one contingent broke and fled, the entire Greek position could collapse. A small force of Athenians stepped forward, not Spartans this time, but men used to fighting without the same rigid discipline. They counterattacked with missile troops of their own. In the chaos, something unexpected happened. The Persian cavalry commander was thrown from his horse. Surrounded, armored, still fighting, he was killed at close range. It wasn't a victory in any strategic sense. But psychologically, it mattered. The Greeks had drawn blood. They paraded the body through their lines. For the first time in days, morale lifted. And for the first time, Mardonius stopped smiling. The small success came with a dangerous side effect. Confidence. Greek commanders began to worry less about Persian arrows and more about something far more immediate. Water. The army's position, while defensible, was far from reliable springs. Men were rationing. Animals were suffering. Supplies had to be brought through narrow mountain passes. Eventually, the Spartan commander Pausanias made a decision. The army would shift closer to a known water source near the plain. Not an attack. Not a retreat. A repositioning. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it exposed everything. As the Greeks moved, Mardonius watched. And he did nothing. No attack. No reaction. Because he had just seen what he was waiting for. Once the Greeks had settled into their new position, the Persian cavalry struck again, this time, not at the soldiers. At their lifeline. Supply convoys moving through the mountain passes were intercepted. Oxen were slaughtered. Drivers were killed. Food never arrived. The Greeks weren't starving yet. But they could see it coming. Then came the final blow. Persian horsemen rode straight to the primary water source feeding the Greek camp and destroyed it, trampling it into mud and filth. By nightfall, an army of tens of thousands had no clean water. No secure food supply. And an enemy that could strike anywhere. The standoff was over. Not because a battle had been fought, but because the Greeks were being slowly suffocated. As darkness fell, arguments erupted. Some commanders demanded an immediate attack. Others called for retreat. Pride clashed with survival. Pausanias saw the truth. If they stayed, the army would collapse without a fight. If they charged, they would die in the open. There was only one option left. A night withdrawal. Not a rout. Not an escape. A carefully timed movement to a safer position, closer to water, under cover of darkness. It was one of the most dangerous maneuvers an army could attempt. And it would not go as planned. The plan was simple. Too simple. Under cover of darkness, the Greek army would quietly withdraw from its exposed position and regroup closer to the hills, where water was still available and cavalry would be less effective. No torches. No shouting. No hesitation. Every unit was to move at the same time. If even one section failed, the entire army could be exposed at dawn, scattered, disorganized, and helpless. This was not a maneuver meant for heroes. It was a maneuver meant for survival. And that made it dangerous. The signal was given. And immediately, things went wrong. In the center of the Greek line, Allied contingents panicked. Orders were misunderstood. Rumors spread faster than commands. Some units didn't withdraw, they ran. Not to the agreed position. Not to safety. They kept moving until they reached the town of Plataea itself, clustering around temples and stone walls, effectively removing themselves from the battle altogether. In the darkness, half the army disappeared. On the Spartan right wing, the problem was the opposite. Not fear. Pride. A Spartan commander refused to move. To him, withdrawal, even tactical, was dishonor. He argued openly, loudly, while the rest of the army tried to vanish into the night. Time slipped away. Voices rose. Tempers flared. While the enemy camp lay only a short distance away. Eventually, the Spartan column began to move without him, hoping he would follow. He did, but too late. The sky began to lighten. Birds stirred. And across the plain, Persian sentries looked up from their fires and froze. The Greek position was empty. Or so it seemed. What they actually saw was worse. The Greek army wasn't retreating in formation. It was fragmented. The center was gone. The Athenians were separated by hills and distance. And the Spartans were stretched into a long, uneven column, caught mid-march with no defensive position prepared. To the Persian command, it looked like a collapse. A retreat turning into a rout. Mardonius didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for careful formations. He didn't pause to consider caution. He gave the order to pursue. Persian cavalry surged forward first, crossing the river in a flood of dust and noise. Behind them came infantry, fast, light, aggressive. The Spartans turned to face them with no time to prepare. No high ground. No secure water. No allies at their flanks. Only discipline. They halted. Locked shields. And waited. Then the arrows came. Thousands of them. The sky darkened as volley after volley slammed into bronze shields and exposed flesh. Men fell without ever swinging a weapon. Others screamed and dropped, pierced in places armor couldn't protect. And still, the Spartans did not advance. They could not. In their world, battle did not begin until the signs were right. Their commander called for sacrifice. A ritual performed under fire. A priest was brought forward. An animal was killed. The omens were red. They were bad. So they waited. More arrows fell. More men died. Slaves and lightly armored troops suffered the worst. They had no bronze to hide behind. Only wicker shields and skin. Fear spread, not panic, but disbelief. Why weren't they moving? Another sacrifice. Still bad. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The Persians, emboldened by the lack of resistance, pushed closer, confident that the legendary Spartan fury had finally broken. But discipline held. Not because it felt heroic, but because breaking it would mean annihilation. Finally, the signs changed. The order came. When the statues moved, the Spartan line surged forward. Not as individuals. Not in chaos. As a single mass of bronze and muscle. The impact was devastating. Persian shields splintered. Light armor collapsed under heavy thrusts. Men were crushed beneath the weight of the advancing formation. What had been a slow execution turned into a violent reversal. The Spartans didn't chase. They pushed. Step by step. Shield to shield. Driving the enemy backward through force, not speed. And at the center of the chaos stood the Persian commander himself, visible, mounted, directing the fight. The Spartans began to shift. Not toward victory. Toward a target. Wars in the ancient world were fragile things. They didn't end when one side lost more men. They ended when one side lost its nerve. And nerve was tied to leadership. At Plataea, that leadership had a name, a face, and a white horse. Mardonius fought close enough to be seen. He wasn't watching from a hill or hiding behind walls. He moved with his guard, issuing commands, rallying formations, forcing his men forward as the Spartan wall advanced. As long as he remained upright, the Persian army still believed it could win. The Spartans understood that. They didn't shout it. They didn't signal it. They simply began to lean their weight in one direction. The Spartan formation shifted subtly, grinding forward not toward the largest concentration of enemies, but toward the point where commands were coming from. Persian troops threw themselves into the gap, desperate to slow the advance. Shields broke. Spears snapped. Bodies piled underfoot. The battlefield compressed. Noise collapsed into chaos, metal on metal, shouting, the sound of men struggling for breath beneath armor and dust. Then it happened. Accounts differ on the exact moment. Some say a spear struck. Others say a thrown object crushed his skull. What matters is this. Mardonius fell. He hit the ground hard, and he did not rise. For a brief second, nothing changed. Then everything did. The moment the army realized. News doesn't travel neatly in battle. It spreads through instinct. Persian soldiers looked for commands that didn't come. They searched for banners that no longer moved. And when they saw the white horse without its rider, something broke. This was no longer a coordinated fight. It was fear. Units began to pull back, not in formation, but in confusion. Orders contradicted each other. Men shouted warnings that turned into screams. The Spartan advance did not speed up. It didn't need to. The enemy was already unraveling. Once the Persian line gave way, discipline collapsed. Men ran. Toward the fortified camp. Toward the river. Anywhere away from the bronze wall pressing forward. Some commanders tried to regroup behind defenses. Others fled entirely, taking thousands with them and abandoning the rest to their fate. The Persians who made it back to their fortified camp believed they had escaped death. They were wrong. The camp became a trap, tens of thousands of men packed behind wooden walls with nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to retreat. The Spartans arrived moments later. And this is where the story changes tone. The Greeks breached the camp with help from their allies, tearing down sections of the defenses piece by piece. Inside, there was no space for formations. No tactics. Only killing. This was not the heroic clash of armies described in later retellings. It was close, brutal, and absolute. There were no negotiations. No prisoners taken. The frustration of months. The memory of burned cities. The humiliation of Thermopylae. It all ended here. When the fighting finally stopped, the Persian force that had remained in Greece was effectively destroyed. The invasion was over. But the cost was not finished being paid. When silence fell over the field, the Greeks realized something unsettling. They hadn't just won a battle. They had eliminated a threat so completely that there would be no one left to argue with the outcome. And victory left behind questions that couldn't be answered with spears. Who had they become to achieve it? And what would they do next? The field of Plataea was littered with wealth, gold, silver, fine fabrics, luxury beyond anything most Greek soldiers had ever seen. And among it stood the Spartan commander who had held the line. Pausanias. Victorious. Respected. And already changing. The Battle of Plataea ended the Persian invasion of Greece. That part is simple. After Plataea, Persia never again marched an army into mainland Greece. The war that had threatened to erase entire cities ended in a single, decisive collapse. Strategically, it was a triumph. Historically, it was salvation. But victory is rarely clean. And it never comes without consequences. When the dust settled, the Greek soldiers walked through what remained of the Persian camp. It wasn't just a military base. It was a mobile palace. Gold vessels. Silver furniture. Rich fabrics dyed in colors most Greeks had never seen. For men raised on austerity, especially Spartans, it was overwhelming. There is a famous story about Pausanias, the Spartan commander, standing inside the Persian general's tent. He ordered the Persian servants to prepare a feast exactly as they would have for their fallen master. They did. Then Pausanias ordered his own cooks to prepare a traditional Spartan meal, simple, harsh, barely edible. When both were placed side by side, he laughed. and said something like, "Look at how the Persians lived and then came to take what little we had." It sounded like wisdom. But it was also the beginning of something else. Pausanias returned home as a hero. He had commanded the army that saved Greece. He had stood where others would have broken. But the man who left Plataea was not the same one who had arrived. Slowly, rumors began to spread. That he no longer dressed like a Spartan. That he preferred foreign luxury. That he surrounded himself with guards who were not Greek. Whispers turned into accusations. Then into fear. Some claimed he was communicating with Persia. Others said he dreamed of ruling Greece himself, not as a Spartan, but as something closer to the enemy he had defeated. Whether every accusation was true mattered less than one fact. Victory had changed him. And Sparta noticed. Eventually, Pausanias was recalled and investigated. He denied everything. At first, there was no proof. But Spartan society was unforgiving. When evidence finally surfaced, Pausanias fled, not to an army, not to allies, but to a temple. In the ancient world, sanctuaries were untouchable. So the Spartans did something characteristically ruthless. They sealed the doors. They did not kill him. They let him die. Legend says his own mother placed the first stone at the entrance. Honor before blood. The man who had saved Greece died alone, starved, erased from public memory. Not because he lost, but because he changed. Thermopylae is clean. 300 men. A noble sacrifice. A perfect ending. Plataea is uncomfortable. It has retreat. Confusion. Arguments. Slaughter after victory. And heroes who don't remain heroes. That's why we prefer the story of men who died beautifully to the story of men who lived and paid for it. But history was not decided at Thermopylae. It was decided here. On a dusty plain where discipline outlasted fear. Where survival mattered more than legend. And where victory came at a cost no one wanted to remember. Plataea saved Greece. It allowed Athens to rise. It allowed Greek culture to spread. It shaped the world that followed. But it also revealed something darker. That even the most disciplined societies are vulnerable to power. That winning a war does not protect you from becoming what you fought. And that history remembers sacrifices more kindly than successes. The 300 are remembered because they died. The 10,000 are forgotten because they lived. And showed us what victory really looks like.